We prepare for everything: the job interview, the first date, the wedding, the birth of a child, the retirement party. We rehearse life. Scripted, edited, retouched. We even plan what music we want at our funerals. But no one rehearses the moment that matters most: death, the only certainty. In a world obsessed with control, the one truth, that every being who breathes will someday meet, and yet we don't talk about it. We turn down the volume when it whispers. We change the subject when it starts to speak. We flood the silence with distraction, as if ignoring death might delay it. But death doesn't wait for readiness. It doesn't need your permission. It doesn't care how busy you are, how spiritual you pretend to be, how long your to-do list still is. It arrives with sacred indifference, not as punishment, not as cruelty, but as completion. And the question isn't if. The question is how. How will you meet it? Numb, afraid, begging for more time, or clear, calm, ready? Because there's a secret ancient cultures knew, a truth whispered in temples, carved into stone, and passed from sage to seeker, in breathless silence. To live well, you must die before you die, not in body, but in illusion, in ego, in the small self that clings to control. Because death, in its purest form, is not the end of life. It's the unveiling of it, and the soul, your soul, already knows how to die. It's the mind that forgot. So the journey begins not at the grave, but here, now dash, in the quiet courage, to look at what we've spent lifetimes avoiding, because maybe the real tragedy is not dying too soon, but never living deep enough to know what dying truly is. You see, we prepare for everything in life, but what if it's death we should have been preparing for all along? And what if, just maybe, the ones who prepare for death are the only ones who ever truly learn how to live? The silence has been waiting, not to frighten you, but to remind you. The veil is thinner than you think, and this is where the path begins, not in fear, but in reverence. So take a breath and listen, because the soul is ready, and death is not the enemy. It's the mirror, the teacher, the return, and it's calling you home. We've been taught to chase the light, to seek enlightenment like a sunrise on command, to meditate, breathe, chant, manifest, all in the name of awakening. But there's something no one tells you. Before light there is loss. Before clarity there is surrender. Before awakening there is death, not of the body, but of the self you thought was you. The mystics knew. The saints knew. The ancients in every lineage whispered the same message beneath breath and incense. Die before you die, and you will never die. Because death is not the end. It's an initiation, a ceremony of truth that strips away the illusion of separation. And here's the truth most fear to face. Awakening doesn't begin when you feel peaceful. It begins when everything you've clung to starts to fall away. The Buddhists call it anatta, no self. The Sufis call it fana, the annihilation of the ego. In Christian mysticism, it's the dark night of the soul, a season when everything collapses so something deeper can emerge. Even the Tibetan Book of the Dead, read not just at funerals, but as daily practice, teaches that facing death in life is the only way to move freely through the Bardo, the in-between realms of consciousness after the final breath. Because death doesn't start with the body, it starts with a whisper, a letting go, a shedding of identities, masks, stories. Your job title won't follow you through the veil. Your followers won't walk beside your soul. Your achievements will vanish like smoke. Only presence remains, only essence. And when you learn to let go before death forces your hand, you become free. Free from the fear that keeps you asleep. Free from the grasping that dims your light. Most people think awakening is about becoming more powerful, more joyful, more aligned. But awakening isn't accumulation, it's subtraction. It's becoming less, until what's left is real. The sages sat in caves not to escape life, but to prepare for the only thing that could not be avoided. And the reason they glowed, the reason their eyes held fire, was because they had already died. They had already faced the silence, the emptiness, the unbearable weight of nothingness, and survived. So when death came, they didn't flinch, they didn't plead, they bowed, because they had walked this path before, not once, but every day, in silence, in stillness, in sacred surrender. To awaken is to learn how to die. Not someday, but now. And to die is to remember what can never be taken. When the body falls silent and the last breath fades into stillness, you do not vanish, you cross. And though your hands carry nothing, your soul carries everything. Not your jewelry, not your bank account, not your name, your brand, your birth certificate, but something deeper, something invisible, something vibrational. You carry resonance, the frequency of your choices, the energy of your thoughts, the weight of your attachments, and the shape of your regrets. This is the soul's luggage, and no one walks through the veil without it. In every mystical tradition, from Hinduism's karma to Christianity's final judgment, to the Egyptian weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at, there is the same echo. What you carry within is what follows you beyond. The Bhagavad Gita says, as a person casts off worn-out garments and puts on others that are new, so the embodied soul casts off old bodies and enters into others. But what remains through all those lives is not the flesh, it's the pattern, the vibration, the echo of who you've been. Some souls cross light, weightless, open, calm. Others carry confusion, grief, resistance, and fear. Not because they were bad, but because they didn't know how much they were holding. Attachments are sticky. Even love, when clung to tightly, can weigh the soul down. In the Tibetan tradition, they say that after death, thoughts arise faster than lightning, and what you've repressed, what you've ignored, what you've denied, all come to meet you, not to punish you, but to be integrated, because what you don't face in life becomes your mirror in death. You carry the unsaid apologies, the unforgiven memories, the truths you avoided, the emotions you numbed. This is not a burden imposed on you. It's your own frequency reflected back, without distortion, and it matters, because in the subtle realms, there is no mask to wear, no filter to apply. You are seen completely by yourself most of all. The soul becomes transparent. Everything hidden becomes light. And the only thing that matters is this: did I live aligned with my essence, or did I spend a lifetime performing someone else's script? This is why the mystics spent lifetimes purifying their hearts, why monks wept during prayer, why yogis chanted the names of the divine. In empty caves under starlight, they weren't trying to impress God. They were lightening the load, because the soul can only rise when it has nothing left to prove, when it's not clinging, not hiding, not running. So ask yourself, If today was the crossing, what would follow you? Because what you carry doesn't disappear when you die. It becomes where you wake up next. The ancients understood something we have forgotten. No one walks calmly into death without rehearsal. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't fear. It was preparation, spiritual training for the final crossing. Across cultures and continents, from Himalayan caves to Sufi gatherings, from Taoist monasteries to Amazonian rainforests, monks, mystics, and shamans all practiced one thing in common. They learned how to die before they died. They called it ego death, conscious dying, spiritual surrender, not as a metaphor, but as a lived experience. Because death wasn't a stranger to be feared. It was a teacher, a sacred rite of passage, and those who met it daily in ritual were not terrified when it came for real. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there is a practice called Phowa, the art of conscious dying. Practitioners visualize the soul leaving the crown of the head at the moment of death, training the mind to stay awake through the transition. It is not a performance, it is a devotion, a rehearsal for the moment that will matter most. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, death is described not as an end, but as a journey the soul must navigate. A map was left, not for the body, but for consciousness itself. The Sufis, wandering mystics of Islam, practiced fana, the dissolution of the ego, through love, prayer, and surrender. They danced, not to celebrate life, but to dissolve in the divine. Even in the Amazon, ayahuasca ceremonies are not recreational. They are deaths, miniature initiations, the purge, the visions, the trembling. They are not side effects. They are sacred signs that something is dying and something truer is being born. To die before you die is not about pain, it's about release. The release of the false self, the release of the masks, the release of control. Because what most people call life is just layers of identity, defense, and noise. And when death comes, all of it burns away. But if you've already died, if you've met the silence, if you've stared at the void and bowed, you don't burn, you rise. This is why the monks fast, why the shamans purge, why the mystics sit in stillness for hours. Not to punish the body, but to release its grip on identity. Because when the ego dissolves, when the mind softens, you glimpse something beyond yourself, something eternal. And that glimpse, even for a moment, prepares the soul more than a lifetime of denial ever could. You see, modern life fears death because it never pauses, never empties, never listens. But the ancients knew the body must kneel before the soul can stand. And death is not a thief. It is a threshold, one we must learn to approach, not with panic, but with reverence. And reverence, like anything sacred, requires practice. At the final breath, what you've avoided comes to meet you, not to punish, but to be seen. This is the moment most fear, not the silence, not the stopping of breath, but the mirror. Because when the body lets go, the mind doesn't lead anymore. The soul does. And the soul does not speak in excuses. It doesn't wear titles. It doesn't hide behind ambition or personality. It shows you. And if a person has spent their life distracted, numbed, disconnected, that meeting is terrifying. This is why most souls panic in the final moment. Not because death is painful, but because it is honest. It strips away everything that isn't real. And for those who have built their identity on the unreal, that moment feels like collapse. The ego doesn't know how to die. It clings, It negotiates. It bargains for one more minute, one more breath, one more illusion of control. And when that fails, it panics. Across near-death experiences, across faiths, across continents. We hear it again and again. Those who resist death experience turbulence, a sense of falling, of being torn from the body, of confusion, of fear. But those who surrender, who let go, report light, peace, clarity. The difference is not the moment itself, it's what the soul brings to it. The mystic Saint Rumi wrote, "Try to learn to let what is going to happen, happen. Because at the edge of death, control becomes poison, and surrender becomes medicine. Yet we live lives of control, of endless distraction, of surface, of avoidance. We avoid stillness, we avoid silence, and we avoid grief, we avoid the shadow. And then we are surprised when death feels like terror. But how could it not? If you've never practiced letting go, how can you expect to master it? At the most sacred threshold of your existence, if your whole life has been a rehearsal for clinging to success, to identity, to your story, then death becomes a thief. But if your life has been a journey of slowly, courageously letting go, then death becomes a doorway. This is why so many spiritual traditions emphasize death meditation. In Tibetan Buddhism, monks sleep in graveyards. In Stoic philosophy, memento mori, remember you will die, was carved into every moment, not to depress the soul, but to awaken it. Because when you remember death daily, you stop pretending, you stop delaying, you stop running, you start living. And at the end, you do not panic, you do not grasp, you do not plead. You exhale, and you walk into the mystery like one returning home. The self you think you are cannot walk through the sacred gate, not because it's unworthy, but because it was never meant to. That self, the one built on roles, achievements, memories, opinions, is temporary. It was made to help you move through this world, to function, to survive, to belong. But survival is not awakening. Belonging is not liberation. And when the time comes to cross, none of those layers can come with you. The mystics called it ego death, the dissolving of the false self, not through violence but through truth. Because the ego is not evil, it's just loud with fear, loud with preference, loud with control. And death is silence. So the ego, when unprepared, does not know how to enter. It bangs on the door, it recites its name, it offers credentials, but the gate doesn't open to identity, it opens to essence, and essence has no name. This is why so many spiritual paths center on unlearning, letting go, shedding skins that no longer serve. In Buddhism, ego is called anatta, no fixed self. It's not a belief, it's a practice, a daily remembering that you are not your thoughts, not your face, not even your memories. In Christian mysticism, the Desert Fathers wrote of kenosis, self-emptying, pouring oneself out, so only the divine remains. And in Sufism, the whirling dance is not for performance, it's a prayer dash, a spinning away from the self, until only the beloved remains. Because if you cling to your story, you cannot cross. If you need to be right, you cannot see. If you identify with the mask, you will forget the face behind it. The ego will tell you. It can prepare you for death. It will read the books, say the mantras, light the candles, but all of that is just noise until you're willing to let it go, to look at your story and say, thank you, but I'm not you, to see your face in the mirror and know it's just the costume, not the soul. This is not easy. It is the hardest door to open because it's the first, and the ego guards it. It will whisper, you're already awake, you're already enough, don't go deeper, stay here, it's safe. But awakening doesn't happen in safety, it happens in surrender. The moment you loosen your grip on who you think you are, the gate begins to open. You may feel disoriented, like parts of you are dying, and they are, because to walk into the sacred, the real sacred, something must die. And what dies is everything that was never truly you. So you can finally meet what was always waiting on the other side. There is a part of you that lives in the basement. It doesn't speak often, but it never stops watching. This is the shadow, the forgotten self, the buried truth, the emotional residue we've locked away. Not because it was evil, but because it was uncomfortable. Carl Jung didn't just study the unconscious, he warned us. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. And when death comes, when the body releases and the veil begins to lift, what's unconscious doesn't stay hidden. It blooms, because death, in every mystical tradition, is not just the end of the body, it's an unveiling. In Tibetan death texts, like the Bardo, we're told that after the last breath, visions appear, light, forms, sounds, some peaceful, some terrifying, but they are not outside forces. They are you, your desires, your fears, your attachments, your shadow, amplified in full color, no longer filtered by the mind. And the instructions are clear. Do not run, do not cling, do not believe what you see. Remain aware, because every image is a mirror. This is why the mystics trained themselves. They didn't try to get rid of the shadow. They faced it, named it, befriended it, not to be consumed by darkness, but to walk through it with light. Shadow work is not therapy. It's not self-help. It's initiation. It's the willingness to look at your rage, your shame, your jealousy, your grief, and say, Dash, you are not my enemy. You are my reflection. Because what we repress in life doesn't disappear. It waits. And when the ego finally cracks, when the outer identity dissolves, the shadow steps forward, not to haunt you, but to integrate. The fear of being seen, the guilt from the past, the wound you never named, they all rise at the end, because that's the moment. You can no longer pretend. You are naked, not physically, energetically, and everything you didn't resolve in life becomes your teacher in death. But here's the gift. You don't have to wait. You can begin now. You can turn toward the shadow before the final breath. And every moment you do, every emotion you meet, every truth you face, lessens the weight you'll carry. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to clear everything. But you do need to be willing, because the soul doesn't fear darkness. It only fears denial. And the more light you bring to the hidden places, the softer your death becomes. Not because the veil changes, but because you do. There is no escape, only reflection. At the final moment, you are not judged. You are shown. And what is shown is not your resume, not your intentions, not even your beliefs. What is shown is your frequency. Because energy never lies, and death is the great amplifier. In nearly every mystical tradition, from Egyptian texts to Vedic scriptures, death is described not as a punishment, but as a revelation, a mirror that does not bend to ego or flattery. You meet yourself as you truly are, not who you hope to be, not who others thought you were, but the vibration you've cultivated across years, across lifetimes. In Tibetan Buddhism, they speak of karma dash, not as moral punishment, but as momentum. Whatever thoughts, actions, and emotions you invested in, create your soul signature, your resonance, and at death, that resonance is everything. Because what you carry within becomes the environment you wake into. If your soul vibrates with peace, you see light. If it resonates with fear, you see confusion. If it's heavy with anger, you feel resistance. You don't suddenly become enlightened just because your body stops. Death doesn't erase your energy, it reveals it. This is why Sufi mystics practiced remembrance, dhikr, to keep their hearts aligned with love until their very last breath, not because they feared punishment, but because they knew the soul reflects its last direction. Every emotion you suppress, every resentment you hold, every illusion you cling to, it becomes part of your field, and the field follows you, beyond the veil. There are no masks in that space, only essence, only vibration. And what you have avoided, what you have denied, what you have refused to feel, will no longer hide behind the noise of this world. The mystics taught this for a reason. They weren't obsessed with death. They were obsessed with truth, because they knew this life is not a performance. It's a preparation. And every moment you choose love instead of control, presence instead of distraction, truth instead of comfort, you shift your frequency, you tune the soul, so that when the moment comes and the mirror rises, you recognize your reflection. You're not surprised. You're not afraid. You are simply returned to yourself. This is the power of spiritual practice, not to earn some cosmic reward, but to refine your resonance, so that when the breath leaves the body, your energy does not scatter. It sings, and death becomes not a rupture, but a remembering. Some say death is like sleep, but that's not quite true, because in sleep, you can drift without resistance. But in death, what you cling to clings to you. Attachments are not just emotions. They are energetic tethers, invisible threads, that bind the soul to form, to memory, to identity. And when the time comes to cross, those threads don't break easily. They pull, they whisper, they anchor you back to what was. This is why in so many traditions, from Buddhist detachment to Stoic release, the art of letting go was never optional. It was essential, because clinging in life creates confusion in death. The Tibetan Book of the Dead warns of this. It says that in the Bardo, the realm between death and rebirth, what you desire most and what you fear most both appear before you. And those who cannot let go follow the illusion instead of the truth. The soul, if burdened by attachment, reaches back to the house, to the body, to the people left behind, to the words unsaid, to the apology never spoken. And the more it reaches, the more it forgets to move forward. This is how souls become lost. Not because they are evil, but because they are entangled. Entangled in guilt, in control, in fear. Even love, when attached, becomes heavy. So what does letting go really mean? It doesn't mean not caring. It doesn't mean abandoning your life. It means releasing the illusion of ownership. You don't own the people you love. You don't own your story. You don't even own this body. Everything is on loan. And the wise ones, the monks, the mystics, the elders, they practiced giving it back. They practiced saying goodbye while still alive, not out of depression, out of devotion. They understood the sacred paradox that to fully love something, you must be willing to let it go. Letting go is not weakness, it is mastery. To release resentment when it feels justified, to forgive even when it aches, to surrender control and still move forward with courage. These are not soft gestures, they are spiritual revolutions, because every time you let go, you grow lighter, and at the final breath, what's light rises. So if you want to prepare for death, start with your grip. What are you holding on to? Whose approval are you still chasing? What fear sits at the base of your spine, quietly running your life? Meet it, hold it, and slowly let it go. Because the soul doesn't walk into eternity with bags. It walks with presence, with truth, with openness. And the only way to arrive is to release everything that tells you you can't. Next, we'll descend into the labyrinth of memory. Because not all attachments are conscious, and some are made of time itself. They don't regret failing. They regret not feeling. In the final moments of life, when the machine's slow, when the noise fades, when there is no one left to impress, a strange kind of clarity rises. It's not intellectual, it's not religious, it's raw, visceral, truth without the armor. Hospice nurses across the world have heard it, whispers between breaths, eyes wet with the weight of memory, not screaming, but soft, almost like a confession, but not to others, to themselves. I wish I had been more present. I wish I hadn't waited so long to say what mattered. I wish I let myself be loved. It's never about the job title, or the house, or the followers, or the things collected and clung to. It's always about the feeling, the moments missed while chasing something else, the words held back out of pride, the walls built from fear and never taken down. Bronnie Ware, a palliative nurse, wrote a book, The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. It became a quiet gospel in spiritual spaces, because what it revealed wasn't new. It was ancient, remembered, and the most common regret. I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. This is not just poetic reflection, it's soul-level wisdom, because in those final hours, the ego softens, the roles fall away, the mask slips, and the soul begins to speak. It does not speak in achievement. It speaks in presence, in connection, in what was truly felt. The Near-Death Experience Research Foundation has collected thousands of testimonies from those who temporarily crossed over, and across countries, cultures, beliefs. The patterns are startlingly similar. People don't speak of success. They speak of beauty, of love, of moments where the heart opened, or where it should have, but didn't. They talk of laughter they held back, forgiveness they postponed, risks they didn't take, because fear was louder than freedom. And when they come back, if they come back, they don't want a bigger life. They want a truer one. We are trained to pursue, to perform, to protect ourselves from pain. But in doing so, we often protect ourselves from life. We scroll through years, half feeling, half present, convincing ourselves we'll feel it later, when things settle, when we have time, when it's safe. But death doesn't care about calendars. It doesn't wait for closure. It comes when it comes. And when it does, all that's left is what we didn't let ourselves feel. So if you want to prepare for death, start by feeling your life. Feel the sorrow, feel the wonder, feel the love, say the things, hold the hands, let the tears come. Because at the end, what the soul regrets is not what it didn't get, it's what it didn't give. Most people fear death, not because it ends life, but because it exposes it. We imagine death as a thief, an intruder, the one who sneaks in at the edge of time to steal everything we've built, everything we've loved, everything we've become. But what if death doesn't take anything? What if it simply reveals? It doesn't rob us. It reflects us. It holds up a mirror to our life and says, dash, dash, here. This is what you made of your time. This is how deeply you loved. This is what you ran from and what you returned to. This is the life you truly lived, not the one you imagined or curated or performed, but the one you embodied. For many, that's the real fear. Not the moment the breath stops, but the moment before, when everything becomes clear. Because when the veil lifts, when the ego loses grip, when the soul steps forward, there is no more hiding. The truth arrives, not with fire and thunder, but with silence. And in that silence, you see it, not the facts of your life, but the feeling of it, the resonance, the essence. You feel the relationships you neglected, the creativity you silenced, the forgiveness you withheld, the joy you postponed, for a someday that never came. In ancient Egyptian tradition, they believed that when you died, your heart was weighed against a feather, not your mind, not your achievements, your heart. And if it was heavy with guilt, regret, resentment, you couldn't pass into the next world, because the heaviness wasn't punishment, it was reflection. In the Gnostic texts, death is described not as an end, but as a revealer of the soul's true light. Not what others saw, what you became, beneath the layers of identity. It's not death we should fear. It's a life unlived, a heart unopened, a truth unspoken. Because death doesn't strip you down. It peels back what was never real to begin with. You don't lose anything that was truly yours. Only what you borrowed. The masks, the fears, the roles, the illusions. And what remains is you, naked, timeless, true. So maybe the question isn't, what will death take from me? Maybe the question is, what will it reveal about me that I've been too afraid to see? Because if you walk through life, avoiding truth, avoiding feeling, avoiding your soul's call, death doesn't punish that. It just shows it. And the pain you feel in that final reflection is not cruelty. It's clarity. And maybe, just maybe, that clarity is the final gift. Before the soul crosses, there is a moment, a pause, not outside but within, a stillness where time holds its breath, and the body, for once, falls silent. And in that stillness, ritual begins. Because long before hospitals and white walls, long before beeping monitors and chemical sedation, there were elders, there were chants, there was rhythm, breath, fire, scent. In ancient Vedic traditions, the body was never treated as disposable. It was sacred, a vessel, a temple to be purified before the soul took flight. The Garuda Purana, one of the sacred texts of Hinduism, details the journey of the soul after death. But it doesn't begin with death. It begins before, with preparation, with cleansing, oils, mantras, the whisper of sacred syllables across skin, a body anointed not out of superstition, but out of reverence. Because how you leave matters. In Taoist alchemy, the body is seen as a garden of qi, life force energy, and death is not departure, but transformation. So the sages practiced long before the end. They prepared the breath, they stilled the mind, they regulated the channels of energy, so the soul could flow out smoothly, without rupture, without fragmentation. They knew the subtle body could not be crammed into ceremony at the last minute. It needed cultivation, daily ritual, movement, silence, fasting, toning. These were not health trends. They were spiritual hygiene. And in Sufism, oh, the beauty there. Death was not a door slammed shut. It was fana, the annihilation of the self in the divine. And so they sang, dervishes spinning in rhythm with the cosmos, poetry that cracked the ego open like a shell. The body prepared not with fear, but with surrender. They whispered the names of God, as incense curled through the air, not to escape death, but to meet it clearly. You see, ritual is not about perfection. It's about presence. It's how you slow down the soul, so it can remember where it came from. It's how you say, I'm not just a body. I am breath. I am memory. I am awareness. And I'm ready to return. Modernity calls this dramatic, extra, unnecessary. But maybe it's modernity that forgot something. Because when you treat death like a transaction, you miss the initiation. When you reduce it to biology, you lose the beauty. Every ancient culture had a way, a path, a rhythm to walk the soul from one world to the next. It wasn't rushed, it wasn't numb, it was sacred, because they knew what we forgot. A soul that is carried in ritual arrives lighter. So if you want to prepare for death, don't wait for the end. Make your life a ritual. Breathe like it matters. Walk like you're arriving. Speak like it echoes. The soul listens. And when the moment comes, so does the silence. Before the soul can rise, it must first be emptied. And not of the physical, not of possessions or positions or pride, but of something heavier, resentment, bitterness, the memories you sealed in silence, the ones that still burn quietly when their name crosses your mind. This ... is the weight most people carry across the veil, not what was done to them, but what they refuse to let go of. And so forgiveness, in its truest form, isn't about the other person. It never was. It's about you, your freedom, your peace. It's the decision to stop bleeding into the future. From wounds the past no longer remembers, the sacred texts of nearly every tradition speak of this. In the Yoga Vasista, forgiveness is considered one of the highest virtues, a dissolver of karma, a purifying fire that clears the subtle body of impressions that bind. In Sufi mysticism, forgiveness is fana, the annihilation of the self that clings so that the soul can remember. It is not separate from the one. The Prophet Muhammad said, "Forgive others, not because they deserve forgiveness, but because you deserve peace." Even in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there are rituals before and after death, specifically for unspoken pain, because the soul remembers, and what it remembers, it relives again and again until it is released. We tend to think of forgiveness as a favor we offer after someone apologizes, but in spiritual terms, forgiveness is not transactional. It is transformational. You do not need the other person to understand. You do not need the past to be rewritten. You need only the courage to unhook your soul from the weight it's been dragging for lifetimes. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It's remembering without hurting anymore. It's saying ... I will not let what wounded me become who I am. It's letting the echo fade. Not because it didn't happen, but because you're ready to return to silence. You see, when you don't forgive, you keep your energy, looping, stuck, attached to the story, instead of the truth behind it. And when death comes, that energy does not vanish. It expands, because what's unhealed doesn't die. It follows. And sometimes, what weighs down a soul is not failure or fear, but unforgiveness. So if you want to walk light, forgive. Not quickly, not blindly, but completely. Speak the names, feel the ache. Say what was never said, even if it's only whispered into the night. And then, release not for them, for you, because the soul was never meant to be a storage room. For ghosts, forgiveness is how you clear the house. Before the journey, it's not a final act, it's a sacred practice. And each time you do it, you rise. There is a subtle trap on the spiritual path. It wears white robes. It speaks softly. It knows the language of energy, of presence, of awakening. And yet, it is still a mask. This is the spiritual ego. And it's harder to release than the material one, because it doesn't shout, "I'm powerful." It whispers, "I'm pure." But the soul doesn't need to be pure. It needs to be real. You can chant mantras, burn incense, collect sacred texts, and still be hiding from yourself. Still be protecting a version of you that isn't ready to dissolve. Because death, true death, doesn't care about your vocabulary. It doesn't care how many ceremonies you attended, how often you meditated, or how soft your voice became. It cares what you still cling to. That's why so many mystics warned about this trap. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the siddhis, psychic powers that come from spiritual discipline, are described not as signs of success, but as distractions for the ego in disguise. Alan Watts once said, "The danger of spiritual practices is that they can become ways of escaping, rather than embracing." The spiritual ego wears many forms. It seeks control through light. It hides pain behind peace. It trades one identity for another. The victim for the healer, the seeker for the teacher, the wounded child for the awakened guide. But no mask crosses the veil. Only the truth does. And that's the hardest part, because you can't take your image with you, not even your spiritual one. You can't cross with your aura polished and your wounds hidden. Death will ask, did you become who you truly are? Not who you performed, not who you branded, not who you hoped others would see, but you, in your rawness, in your mess, in your trembling courage to be seen without armor. In Sufism, this is the meaning of Fanadash, the complete dissolution of self into the divine. Not the self you fixed, the self you surrendered. That's why true mystics rarely spoke of their spiritual achievements. They wept, they fasted, they walked barefoot into the fire of unknowing, because they knew. You don't ascend through transcendence, you ascend through truth, and the spiritual ego cannot hold that truth. It will try, it will quote it, it will dress like it, but when death arrives, there is no stage, there is only the mirror, and in that mirror, you will see not who you thought you were, but what you were still afraid to let go of. So if you want to prepare, don't just drop your titles, drop your performances, drop the need to be seen as anything. Let yourself become unimpressive, unfinished, unclothed in light, because real light doesn't shine for others. It burns, it strips, it cleanses. And only when the spiritual ego dies can the soul, Begin to live. There is a moment on every seeker's path when the ego whispers one final lie. I'm ready. Not in surrender, not in stillness, but in pride. It's subtle, disguised in spiritual language, woven into mantras, wearing the mask of wisdom. But if you look closely, you'll feel it. A tightness, a need to prove, a quiet performance that says, I've faced death already, I've read the text, I've done the inner work. And that is the most dangerous illusion, because real readiness isn't loud. It doesn't declare itself. It doesn't need to. It arrives like the wind, soft, unseen, but unmistakable. The Tibetan Book of the Dead warns that the moment of death reveals everything. Not your achievements, not your knowledge, but your state of being, your attachments, your fears, your hidden clinging. And the soul that walks lightly is the one that has nothing to prove, nothing to hold, nothing left to defend. To be ready is to be empty, but most aren't. They confuse comfort with preparation, stillness with sedation. They've had visions, sure. They've felt the presence of something greater, maybe even wept in the arms of the mystery. But they haven't died. Not really, because to die before you die requires more than spiritual experiences. It requires the loss of self without resistance, the unraveling without the need to reweave. Mystics across traditions knew this. In Sufism, the concept of fana isn't a moment, it's a process of being undone again and again until only God remains. In the Taoist teachings, a sage is not one who claims readiness, but one who embraces the unknown, who moves in rhythm with death, because they've stopped insisting on control. The ego wants to check a box, to graduate, to declare, I've made peace with death. But peace is not a statement. It's a frequency. It's how you breathe when your name no longer matters. It's how you walk when no one is watching. It's what remains when the costumes fall. So ask yourself, when you say you're ready, who's speaking? Is it the soul, empty and open like the sky? Or is it the ego, desperate to be seen as evolved, even in its final act? The truth is, no one is ever fully ready, not in the way the mind imagines, but you can be willing to be stripped, willing to be seen, willing to not know. That's where real readiness begins, not in certainty, but in surrender. Because the veil doesn't open for those who claim they're ready. It opens for those who no longer need to be. They say the final breath is the most important one you'll ever take. Not because it's the end, but because it's the door. In Tibetan Buddhism, this moment is not seen as a tragedy. It's seen as sacred, a portal, a passage, a chance to awaken completely. The Bardo, known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, isn't a book about dying. It's a book about traveling, a guide for the soul, step by step, breath by breath, through the threshold of death and into the space between. But to walk that path well, you must be conscious in the final breath, not afraid, not distracted, not clinging, but fully here. This is why monks train for death, as if it's the greatest ritual of their life, because it is. They meditate not just to quiet the mind, but to familiarize themselves with the moment of dissolution, the loss of thought, the melting of form, the subtle vibration of letting go. They fast not just to purify the body, but to detach from the cravings that trap the soul in form. They chant dash dash, not for the gods to hear, but for the soul to remember. Remember its path home. Remember the sound of truth when the body can no longer speak it. In Hinduism, the Upanishads speak of the final breath as the upward movement of the prana, the life force that, when untethered from attachment, moves through the crown chakra, liberating the soul from the cycle of rebirth, but it only moves upward. If you've lived in alignment, if your thoughts are scattered, if your energy is dense, if your mind clings to fear, the breath scatters too. That's why preparation matters, because the last breath isn't about the lungs, it's about the soul's direction. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna, at the time of death, if one remembers me alone, that person reaches my state. There is no doubt. But how can you remember the divine? If you haven't practiced remembering, if you haven't rehearsed, stillness in chaos, presence in fear, silence when everything wants to scream. The monks knew this. That's why they walk slowly. That's why they bow often. That's why they treat each breath as if it might be the last, not from dread, but from reverence, because they know the portal doesn't open through resistance. It opens through rhythm, and the final breath is not a gasp, it's a prayer. So if you truly want to prepare, don't wait for the last moment to practice letting go. Make every breath a soft rehearsal. Make every silence a sacred step. And when the final breath arrives, you'll walk through it, not as a stranger to the unknown, but as someone who remembers the way home. There is a secret hidden in the breath, one most people never hear, because the world is too loud, because stillness feels like a threat. But the mystics knew, the yogis, the monks, the seers who walked into caves not to hide, but to listen. They knew that breath is not just air, it is spirit. It is the thread between this world and the next. And they learned that by mastering breath, you can simulate death without dying. In yogic science, the practice is called kumbhaka. Breath retention, not holding your breath in tension, but pausing it, in stillness, in trust, in surrender. Because in that space between inhale and exhale, you meet the place that isn't ruled by time. You touch the void, the silence before creation, the stillness after the end. And if you can be calm there, if you can sit inside the emptiness without rushing to fill it, then you begin to understand how to face death without panic. This is why so many ancient traditions included pranayama, controlled breathing, not to relax, but to prepare, to simulate dissolution. Every inhale, a birth, every exhale, a release, and in the pause after, a rehearsal for the great exhale, the one that doesn't return. The Taoists had a saying, still breath, still mind, still mind, still spirit, no fear. In deep meditation, when the breath slows and the senses fade, you begin to detach, not in escape, but in clarity. You realize you are not the noise, you are not the thoughts, you are not even the body that rises and falls with breath. You are the watcher, the witness, the silence behind the breath. Some shamans teach their initiates to lie completely still for hours. No sound, no movement. Eyes closed, heart open, as if dead, but fully present, because in stillness the truth emerges. Not the stories, not the ego, but the raw, unfiltered presence of who you are, without a name. And that is the state you want to carry into death. Not fear, not clinging, but recognition. This is why serious seekers don't wait. They rehearse now. They surrender now. They breathe into silence until silence stops being scary and starts feeling like home. So, when your final breath comes, it's not a collapse, it's a continuation. The doorway opens and your soul walks through, not with resistance but with remembrance, because you've been there before. So tonight, before you sleep, try it. One deep inhale, one long, slow exhale, and then stillness. Listen, feel, bow. The veil thins in silence, and every breath is a rehearsal for return. If you knew your final moment was near, what would you want the room to feel like? Not just the place, but the energy, the atmosphere, the intention. Would there be music playing gently in the background? Would the scent of incense curl through the air like a final prayer? Would someone be there, holding your hand in silence? Or would you be alone, but wrapped in presence so deep that even solitude felt sacred? You see, the body may not have control over the exact moment of death, but the soul can prepare its temple. In every spiritual lineage that honored death, there was a ritual, not superstition, but structure, not religion, but reverence. In Tibetan Buddhism, they place images of enlightened beings next to the dying. Soft chants echo through the space. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is read aloud not just to comfort, but to guide the soul step by step through the Bardos, the realms between this world and the next. In Sufi mysticism, the dying are surrounded by zikr, the rhythmic chanting of divine names, each syllable a thread, weaving a bridge between this world and the infinite. And in the ancient Vedic rites, they placed sacred ashes on the forehead. The body was washed, anointed with oils, wrapped in white, clean, clear, free, not for the living, but for the journey ahead. So ask yourself, if you had the choice, how would you cross? Would you want candles lit in every corner, or complete darkness and silence? Would you want the voice of your favorite teacher playing gently in the background, or the sound of a river, a chant, a whisper? Start designing it now, because the ritual begins before death. You don't create sacred space in the last minute. You live in it, you practice it, you become it. The room you die in should feel like the life you meant to live. You can begin collecting the objects now. A photo that opens your heart, a mantra that steadies your breath, a fabric that reminds your soul it is loved. These are not decorations, they're coordinates, reminders, anchors for the soul as it begins to loosen from form. And when the time comes, when the breath slows and the veil begins to part, you will not be caught off guard. You will be home because you've built it, piece by piece, with intention, with prayer, with love. Create your death ritual, not out of fear, but out of devotion. Because how you cross reflects how you lived. And sacredness is not an accident, it's a choice. They say you can't take anything with you when you die, but that's not entirely true. You can't take your name, your job, your possessions, but you will take something, your frequency. Because when the body falls away, what remains is the vibration of your being, not what you've done, but who you've become. Not your story, but your state. And that state is your real passport, the only one that matters. On the other side of the veil, this is why the mystics spent lifetimes cultivating not beliefs, but frequencies. The Sufis didn't care if you knew the names of God. They asked how gently you walked through your brother's pain. The yogis didn't ask what scripture you could recite. They asked what your breath sounded like in silence. Because those moments, the private ones, the invisible ones, They build your vibration, love, truth, humility, clarity. These are not just virtues. They are energies. They resonate. They survive. And at death, you don't get to fake it. Whatever frequency you lived in will rise to the surface, like smoke. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they speak of the Bardo realm, the intermediate space after death, where the soul sees the projection of its own mind. If your mind was clear, peaceful, loving, that's what you'll encounter. But if your energy was filled with fear, clinging bitterness, that too becomes your mirror. The veil doesn't judge, it reflects. That's why mystics practice death daily, not in drama, in simplicity. They lived in a way that wouldn't need editing at the end. Every small act of compassion became a tuning fork. Every silent moment of surrender became an attunement, and slowly, the soul began to vibrate closer to the divine, because heaven is not a place, it's a frequency. The Taoists say, the sage prepares the spirit, as the potter prepares the clay, soft, open, ready. So how do you build that frequency now? You speak truth. Even when it's hard, you love. Even when it's not returned, you release. Even when it aches to hold on, you sit. Even when your mind demands distraction, every act of stillness becomes a song. Every act of integrity becomes light. And when the final breath comes, your soul doesn't collapse. It ascends, not upward, but inward, to where your real home has always been. So start building it now, not in fear, but in frequency. Because when the moment arrives, you won't carry your resume. You'll carry your resonance. And the gates of the unseen don't open for what you owned. They open for what you embodied. Before the final breath, there is a moment, not one measured in time, but in truth. A moment where the soul pauses, just long enough to ask, what am I still holding? And more importantly, can I let it go? Because dying isn't just a passage, it's a question, and how you answer it shapes everything that follows. The mystics across traditions, the Vedics, the Sufis, the Taoists, they all understood this. The soul doesn't just drift, it chooses, and intention is the compass. In the Tibetan tradition, monks whisper final prayers into the ear of the dying, not to inform, but to remind. They say, let go of all grasping, let the mind rest in its true nature. Because in that final stillness, every choice becomes amplified, every attachment becomes a weight, every prayer becomes a wing. So ask now, before the veil lifts, before the memories blur, before the ego tries to bargain. Who do I need to forgive? Not for their sake, but for yours, because the soul cannot rise while dragging anchors. And what do I release? Control, guilt, old narratives, the stories that hardened you, the roles you played to survive, the resentments that outlived their usefulness. This is the sacred inventory, and it must be done before the departure. In hospice care, many patients speak of the same regrets. Not money, not fame, but words unspoken, love withheld, presence postponed. You don't want that echo to follow you. You want your soul to step through with empty hands and an open heart. That's what it means to die with intention, to meet the moment as a ceremony. So set your questions now, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Ask, have I honored what mattered? Did I leave anything unsaid? Did I meet myself in this life fully, without shame? And am I ready to hand it all back? Because you don't take your legacy, you take your light. You don't carry your followers, you carry your frequency. And the soul that steps through, with grace, is the soul that knew. This life was a gift, not a possession. So when that moment comes, you don't panic. You don't grasp, you breathe, you bow, and you whisper, I have nothing left to hold. I've turned my pain into prayer, my wounds into wisdom, and now I walk through, not as someone who is dying, but as someone who has lived. There's a voice inside you that's been waiting, not your thoughts, not your ego, but your soul. And it's been whispering from behind the noise, behind the distractions, behind the mask you wear, just to make it through the day. But what if you stopped long enough to actually let it speak? Not later, not at the end, now, because the most haunting words in the language of the dying are these. I wish I had said, what truth are you still carrying? What love is still unspoken? What wound still bleeding beneath your silence? You don't have to wait for a diagnosis to write your final letters. You don't have to wait until time is running out to share the words you've been too afraid to say. There is a sacred power in speaking now, while your breath is still yours, while your voice is still steady. In many spiritual traditions, writing letters before death is not an act of sentiment. It's a ritual, a purification of energy, a karmic zaras. In Japan, there is a practice called isho, a will not of property, but of emotion, a farewell letter to loved ones, not to instruct, but to reveal. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be poetic, but it must be honest. Who do you need to write to? Your mother, your father, a friend you haven't spoken to in years, your inner child, because some of these letters aren't for the world. They're for you, to release the unsaid, to open the dam, to give your soul a voice before it's too late. And you'll be surprised. Once you start writing, something ancient comes through. Not your mind, your memory, your essence. You remember who you were before the wounds, before the performance, before life taught you to speak only what's safe. This is not about fixing the past. It's about freeing it so that when the moment comes, you don't leave carrying ghosts in the shape of sentences. You leave lighter. So write the letter, say the thing, open the conversation you've been avoiding. Tell someone you love them without needing to hear it back. Apologize without conditions. Thank someone who never asked for praise, because your soul doesn't need another accomplishment. It needs to be heard. And when you let it speak, you begin the true preparation, not for death, but for completion. Let your words become wings. Let your truth become release, not someday, today, because the soul never forgets what you left unsaid. We were not born into noise. We were born into breath, into rhythm, into the slow dance of heartbeat and wind. The soul doesn't speak in sentences. It speaks in stillness. But in a world addicted to motion, that language has been forgotten. We scroll before we breathe. We reply before we reflect. We fill every empty space with sound, stimulation, distraction, afraid of what the silence might say. But silence is not empty. It's sacred. It is the original temple. And stillness is its doorway. Across every ancient tradition, Taoist monks, Vedic sages, Christian mystics, there is one common thread. The deeper truths do not scream, they whisper, and only the still can hear them. In Taoism, The principle of Wu Wei teaches the power of effortless action, not laziness, presence, to move from harmony, to speak from emptiness, to act from stillness. In the Christian contemplative path, the desert fathers and mothers retreated into silence, not as punishment, but as purification, because they knew noise is not just around us, it's within us. And the real work is quieting the inner storm. Modern neuroscience even affirms this. Studies from the University of Pavia in Italy show that silence, just 2 hours a day, promotes brain cell growth in the hippocampus, the region responsible for memory, emotion, and learning. Silence heals not just the body, but the field, because in silence the soul doesn't have to shout. It just begins to emerge. You start to feel your own presence again. Not the version curated for the world, not the version built on tasks, goals, projections, but the self beneath all of it, the one that doesn't need to perform. Stillness brings you back, but to enter it, truly enter it, requires courage, because silence is also where the shadows rise, where the buried voices come to the surface, where the grief you postponed finally finds breath. But this too is grace, because when the soul is listened to, even if what it brings is pain, it begins to heal. Let the stillness speak, not just when meditating, but in the spaces between. Pause between breaths, pause before speaking, pause before reacting. Create sanctuaries of silence throughout your day, little altars in time, where you come home to your own essence. Because if you do not know how to be with yourself, in stillness, you will not know how to meet yourself. At death, stillness is the rehearsal, silence is the ritual. And when the final moment comes, you won't have to search for the soul's voice. You'll recognize it, because you've been listening all along. We rehearse everything, weddings, presentations, job interviews, but the one moment we cannot avoid, the final breath, we treat like a surprise. Yet in ancient traditions, that moment wasn't feared. It was studied, practiced, honored, not because they were obsessed with death, but because they wanted to master life. In Tibetan Buddhism, there is a term, phowa, the practice of conscious dying. It teaches the practitioner to direct their consciousness at the moment of death, to leave the body with clarity, with grace, with intention. Because if you can stay awake at the threshold of death, you can stay awake through anything. But this rehearsal isn't about morbid imagination. It's about liberation. Because when you truly understand death, when you've walked beside it in meditation, touched its silence in stillness, written your letters, emptied your attachments, you stop living in fear. You stop wasting time on the superficial. You stop chasing applause. You stop being afraid of saying, I love you, or I'm sorry, or I need help. You start living from the center, because you've already seen what it means to leave with nothing. The mystics knew this. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the soul is guided through a series of thresholds. Each one requires it to be lighter, freer, more honest. But those thresholds don't begin at death. They begin in life. Every ego you release, every wound you integrate, every layer you shed, makes that journey smoother, makes this moment fuller, because the death you rehearse is the life you transform. The more you practice letting go, the more you begin to see that so much of what you thought you needed was only ever fear in disguise. We cling not because we're selfish. We cling because we forget that everything we need is already within. The breath, the silence, the presence, the capacity to meet what is. That's what the rehearsal builds, a kind of soul muscle, a memory of truth. So when the final moment arrives, you don't run, you bow, you breathe, you open, and it won't feel foreign. It will feel like home. This is the paradox. To live well, you must practice dying, not to welcome it sooner, but to stop resisting the only certainty. Because those who master death don't walk toward it in fear. They walk through life with fire in their chest and peace in their spine, awake, unburdened, ready. What happens when you're fully present, at the edge of the veil, when the breath slows, but your soul is wide awake, when you don't resist, don't cling, don't flee, but instead you witness. Mystics across traditions have whispered the same truth, that if you meet death consciously, with clarity, with stillness, you don't get dragged, you get to choose. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, this is the promise of the Bardo, commonly known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It teaches that the moment after death is not darkness, not silence, but revelation, a radiance more brilliant than 1,000 suns, not outside you, from you, your own true nature, unfiltered by flesh. And if you can recognize that radiance, not run from it, not mistake it for something else, you can liberate right then. No reincarnation, no cycles, just return. But most don't recognize it because they never practice seeing clearly, because they never practice being still, because presence felt too uncomfortable, too unfamiliar. And so when the radiance rises, they recoil. They seek shadows that feel safer, and they spiral back into form, into forgetting, into another round of remembering. But if you have rehearsed, if you've tasted ego death while alive, if you've sat in the stillness long enough to recognize the soul's voice, then in that moment, you'll know, you'll feel it, and presence will open the gate. This idea isn't only in Buddhism. In Kriya Yoga, masters like Paramahansa Yogananda taught that through deep meditation, you can simulate the moment of death and train your consciousness to rise through the energy centers and exit the body through the crown. So when the body dies for real, you're ready, not in theory, in practice. You don't spiral, you soar. Even in Sufi mysticism, there is a hidden teaching that the real journey begins not when the heart stops beating, but when it starts remembering. And remembrance, Deka, is the practice of staying present with the divine, even in the in-between, even in the crossing. Presence is not passive, it's a power. It is the sword that cuts through illusion. It is the compass that points you home. And when death comes, if you are fully present, you become the guide, not the passenger. You see clearly, you choose wisely, you move freely, not because you're fearless, but because you are there, completely. The body may fall, but you rise, conscious, radiant, ready to return, or ready to remain in the great silence beyond sound. Not all will reach this moment, but all are called to it. The only question is whether you'll answer. Whether body dies matters, because your final breath isn't just something that leaves you. It listens. It listens to the room, to the silence, to the intention hanging in the air. That's why the ancients didn't just wait for death. They prepared for it, not just inside the soul, but around it. In Tibetan monasteries, rooms were cleansed with smoke. Chants echoed through the walls. Mantras whispered beside the ear of the dying, so that the departing soul had something sacred to follow. like a bridge made of sound. In the Christian Hesychast tradition, there were quiet corners of monastic cells, lit by a single candle. The flame wasn't there to fight the dark. It was there to remind that even in the last moment, there is light. And in the Vedic death rites, the body was bathed in oils, surrounded by flowers, the names of divine beings spoken softly, until the very end. Because the environment you die in echoes, it imprints itself on the departing frequency of the soul, not just what you see, but what you feel. Today, most die in sterile hospital rooms, fluorescent lights, machines humming, paper gowns, no ritual, no rhythm. But what if you could reclaim that moment? What if you could create a sacred space to hold the sacred transition? Start now. Build the temple, even if it's small. A quiet corner with candles, photographs of those you love, music that speaks to your soul, a journal left open with your final thoughts, incense that reminds your breath. It's not alone. Speak aloud your prayers, your wishes, your surrender. Let the room remember you not as a patient, but as a pilgrim, one who is crossing, one who is coming home. Ask yourself, if I knew today was the day, what would I want my final moment to feel like? And don't just imagine it, shape it now, because this isn't about controlling death. It's about meeting it as a friend, as a guide, as the final mirror. And when your body finally begins to still, when the breath grows soft and the heartbeat whispers, your soul will feel it. This was a temple. This was a return, not a failure, not an ending. The body dies where it lived, so live in a space that holds the sacred, and let that sacredness be your final scent, your final sound, your final truth. Death deserves a room of light, so give it one. And when the time comes, the light will know how to carry you. What if death doesn't take you? What if it shows you? Not like a thief in the night, but like a mirror at dawn. Still, quiet, and impossibly honest. We were taught to fear death like it was the end, like it rips everything away. But maybe it doesn't remove. Maybe it reveals, because the moment of death isn't a curtain drop. It's a spotlight, and whatever has been hiding inside your soul will suddenly stand center stage. The regrets, the joys, the half-finished songs you never sang, the apologies you whispered too late, the dreams you buried beneath practicality. All of it rises, not to punish, but to show you who you've been and who you could have become. That's why the mystics never called death an end. They called it a return. In Sufi philosophy, death is fana, the dissolution of the false self into divine essence, not vanishing, but unveiling. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the soul is not destroyed, it's weighed, measured not by gold or fame, but by the weight of your heart. Were you light, or did you carry stones no one could see? In Tibetan Buddhism, the Bardo is the in-between, not a void, but a mirror space where the mind creates visions based on the clarity or chaos you carried within. Death doesn't invent, it reflects. This is why those who've tasted near death often come back different. They've seen themselves, not in the mirror of the world, but in the mirror of the eternal. And something in that shakes them clean, because death doesn't just mark time, it completes the circle. The inhale has an exhale, the seed has the soil, The life has the letting go. You came from mystery, you will return to it. But in between is your one chance to see yourself clearly, and death, whether tomorrow or 50 years from now, will make sure of it. So ask yourself, what will the mirror show? Will it show a soul, still hiding behind persona, still clinging to unspoken truths, still running from silence? Or will it show someone who dared to see themselves long before the veil was lifted, because those who meet death as a mirror have already practiced, already looked, already shared what was false to reveal what is real. And for them, the mirror does not hurt, it illuminates. So perhaps death isn't darkness, it's clarity, the kind too bright for the unprepared. And that clarity, it will not lie, it will not flatter, it will simply say dash dash, here is what you brought across. And you will finally understand what cannot be hidden, not from the light, not from yourself, because death isn't the end. It's the most honest moment of your existence, a mirror, waiting, with silence and truth. Next, we walk into what comes after. There is a voice you've been ignoring. It doesn't speak in language. It doesn't shout over your playlists. It doesn't compete with the noise of your to-do list. It waits. Patiently. You've heard it before. In the pause after heartbreak. In the silence before sleep. In the breath that caught when you looked at the stars too long. That was your soul. And it's been whispering something since the moment you were born. I remember. Because the soul does not fear death. The soul has died before. It knows the rhythm, the unraveling, the strange liberation of letting go. What it needs is for you to remember, to step outside the ego's obsession with control, to stop pretending you're just flesh and ambition, to finally listen to the ancient language that lives beneath your skin, the language of letting go. Mystics across traditions have always said, the soul already knows the way. In the Taoist texts, it's called returning to the source. In Sufi writings, it's the remembrance of the beloved. In the Upanishads, it's the Atman Dash, a drop that already knows it is the ocean. But the modern world teaches us the opposite. It teaches forgetting. It distracts. It buries. It floods you with everything but truth. So you forget. You forget that you're not the voice in your head. You're the awareness behind it. You forget that you're not your story. You're the space where all stories unfold. You forget that the fear of death is not a fear of ending. It's a fear of meeting yourself completely. Because when the noise falls away, when the body surrenders and the mind dissolves, only the soul remains. And that moment is not foreign, it's familiar. It's like returning to a room you've been dreaming of for lifetimes. So what does the soul need from you now? Not perfection, not dogma, not rituals borrowed from cultures you don't honor. The soul needs presence. It needs you to sit and feel, to listen, to return, because the soul already knows how to die. It's the mind that resists. It's the ego that panics. It's the personality that fears vanishing. But the soul, it's not afraid. It's just waiting, waiting for you. To stop pretending, to stop running, to stop numbing your life because you're afraid of its end. Because once you remember who you are, not as a name, not as a career, but as a frequency dash, then death loses its edge, not because it vanishes, but because it becomes familiar, and the soul, finally heard, can rise. The next chapter is not about theory, it's about return. Return to where you came from. Return to what you already are. Return to what your soul has never forgotten. You're already dying, but not in the way that terrifies you. You're dying the way a candle does. Slowly, with grace, if you let it. And yet, most people walk through life as if they have forever, as if time is something they own, as if the breath in their lungs is a guarantee, instead of a gift. We plan weddings, we plan retirements, we plan vacations down to the hour, but we never plan for the only moment that's certain, the last one. This is the great lie of modern life, that death is distant, that presence can wait. But the mystics knew better. The Zen monks, the desert saints, the yogis sitting in silent caves, they all practiced death, not to escape life, but to enter it more fully, because once you see the end clearly, everything changes. You begin to feel the urgency, not as panic, but as sacred permission to speak what you've held in silence, to love without hesitation, to forgive, not because it's easy, but because the weight is too heavy to carry, into tomorrow. When you live as if you're already dying, your priorities reorder themselves. Busyness starts to feel like betrayal, numbing becomes poison, and presence becomes a sacred act of rebellion. In the teachings of Pema Chodron, she says, death is certain, but the time of death is uncertain. So what do you do with that? You wake up. You don't postpone your purpose. You don't delay your healing. You don't wait for clarity to arrive in a perfect box. You live now, as if the veil is already thinning. Because it is. The Tibetan Book of the Dead tells us that the moment of death only feels terrifying to those who never practiced dying while alive, but for those who rehearsed. Through silence, through surrender, through letting go of the ego's illusions. Death is not a thief. It is a threshold. So ask yourself, deeply, honestly, if I knew the door would open tomorrow, would I change how I show up today? Would I let go of the argument I've rehearsed 100 times? Would I finally write the letter I've been afraid to send? Would I sit in stillness long enough to hear the soul I've been avoiding? Because the moment is coming. Not someday, every day. Every sunset is a reminder. Every wrinkle, every grey hair, every goodbye. They are not decay. They are invitations. Live with urgency, but not fear. Live with reverence, not panic. Live as if you are already dying, because you are. And in that truth lives your greatest awakening. The ones who are truly awake aren't the ones who fear death the least. They're the ones who bow to it with open eyes and an open heart. And that is the beginning of true life. The kind you don't just survive, but consecrate. Your next breath is not a promise. It's a portal. Step through it with presence. There is a moment. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or flashing lights, or a voice booming from the heavens. It arrives in silence. It arrives in breath. It arrives when you least expect it, and exactly when you need it. The moment where you must choose to run or to return, to deny the path ahead or to walk toward it with sacred eyes. This is not a metaphor. It is the most important decision you will ever make, because death is coming, not to punish, not to steal, but to reveal. And when it does, you will not be asked how much you earned, how many followers you had, how well you performed the part of you. You will be asked something far more ancient. Did you love? Did you listen? Did you live? Awake. The mystics knew that death was not the end, but the unveiling. In Sufi wisdom, It is said that death is not the extinguishing of the flame, but the removing of the lamp's cover. And the light underneath, it's always been there. You just forgot to look. But to look, truly look, means you must stop running. You must stop bargaining. Stop delaying. Stop pretending that this life is anything but temporary. Because once you admit that, you don't become morbid. You become free. The fear begins to loosen its grip. The noise loses its power. And suddenly, what matters becomes luminous. Forgiveness, presence, stillness, truth. And that clarity is the gate. You don't have to wait for the last breath to open it. You just have to choose. Choose not to numb yourself with endless motion. Choose not to decorate the cage and call it a temple. Choose not to bow to fear when reverence is still an option. Because death is not the enemy. The real enemy is forgetting that you were born to cross that threshold with your soul intact, and not just intact, but radiant. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells Arjuna, death is as sure for that which is born as birth is for that which is dead. So do not grieve, prepare. The choice is not between life and death. That part is already written. The choice is between resistance and readiness, between fear and sacred vision, between forgetting and remembering. The most important decision you will ever make is to walk toward the fire with open arms and say, I am ready. Not because you know what's beyond, but because you know what's within. And that soul creator is where the real voyage begins. You are never meant to survive forever. Not this body, not this name, not this story you've memorized so well. You forgot it was just a story. What you were meant to do was awaken before the end, before the last inhale, before your name becomes an echo in someone else's memory. And that awakening, it doesn't wait. It doesn't schedule itself for when you're older or wiser or less busy. It begins now, because preparation isn't about death. It's about presence. The ritual doesn't start at the hospital. It doesn't start with a diagnosis. It doesn't start when the countdown begins. It starts when you realize you're alive, fully, moment to moment, breath to breath. That realization, that is the doorway. And yes, it asks everything of you. It asks for your illusions, your masks, your excuses, your distractions, your false peace. It asks you to trade what is comfortable for what is true. But in that trade, you don't lose yourself. You meet yourself, the real you, the one beneath the pretending, the one who already knows how to die well, because it has practiced being fully alive. In the ancient Bardo, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, we are told that the moment of death reveals the mind's truest nature, and that to die consciously, you must live consciously. Every act of attention is preparation. Every act of forgiveness is alignment. Every breath you take in stillness is one more stone laid on the path that will carry you home. So you begin here, not with answers, but with awareness, not with panic, but with practice, the kind of practice that feels ordinary, until it doesn't. Washing a dish, listening without interrupting, lighting a candle with reverence, speaking truth even when your voice shakes. These are not small acts. They are ceremonies in disguise. You don't have to fast in a cave. You don't have to chant for 40 days. You just have to show up with presence, with humility, with the courage to meet your life as if it were already your death. Because it is. Every day is one step closer, not to the end, but to the unveiling. And if you prepare, not with fear but with flame, not with armor but with openness, you will not be taken, you will be received. And one day, when the smoke rises and the final breath curls into silence, you will not tremble, you will bow, you will smile, you will remember that the soul was never afraid. It was only waiting for you to awaken. So if you're ready, truly ready, we walk together. From this moment forward, the ritual has already begun. With breath, with stillness, with sacred remembering. This is not the end. This is the beginning. We are the hidden voyage, and the voyage has just begun. If this journey moves something in you, don't let it end in silence. Let it echo. Share it with someone still afraid to speak of death, still avoiding the mirror, still pretending time is infinite. Let this video be the hand you extend, the torch you pass, the doorway they didn't know they were seeking. Leave a comment, not just to speak, but to witness. What part of you is beginning to awaken? What have you been avoiding that now asks to be seen? And if your soul feels ready, ready to keep walking, deeper, quieter, truer, then this is your place. Not just a channel, but a temple. Subscribe and join a circle of seekers who no longer run from the end because they've begun to live from it. We release these videos like offerings, each one a prayer, each one a mirror, each one a map to awaken before the end, to remember who you are beneath the name, to walk together toward what cannot die, one breath at a time, one truth at a time, one sacred step on the hidden voyage. Soul whisper and soul creator. The hidden voyage. If this journey moves something in you, don't let it end in silence. Let it echo. Share it with someone still afraid to speak of death, still avoiding the mirror, still pretending time is infinite. Let this video be the hand you extend, the torch you pass, the doorway they didn't know they were seeking. Leave a comment, not just to speak, but to witness. What part of you is beginning to awaken? What have you been avoiding that now asks to be seen? And if your soul feels ready, ready to keep walking, deeper, quieter, truer, then this is your place. Not just a channel, but a temple. Subscribe and join a circle of seekers who no longer run from the end because they've begun to live from it. We release these videos like offerings, each one a prayer, each one a mirror, each one a map to awaken before the end, to remember who you are beneath the name, to walk together toward what cannot die, one breath at a time, one truth at a time, one sacred step on the hidden voyage. Soul whisper and soul creator. The hidden voyage.